Brethren, so great to be here. I've been loving Nashville. I really want to thank Worshipful Brother Warren for asking me to come out. We've been in contact for some time. I met him a few years ago in Long Beach, few years ago in Long Beach. That was fantastic. And then Turbo, who some people call Ryan, Turbo has been a great friend, and it's just been a great time. You know, I've been sort of around downtown in your beautiful city here, Nashville, and had a great time at the Parthenon. And Sam and Steve, wherever Steve is, also showed me a good time. And, you know, it's just been great. You got a lot of classic kind of history. They say the Athens of the West. Is that not what they say? The South, West, South. So, yeah, it's really, really cool. So stoked to be here, very excited. I think I've got a great presentation for you that should hit the middle of the room. You know, there's nothing super, I'm not going to get all deep Kabbalistic, astrological stuff. You know, I'm not going to alienate anybody. Maybe you know, maybe you don't. Some of my work can get a little esoteric, you know. But some people like that, you know. Some people don't. But this one is just every single I can assure you, every single Freemason should be able to get something about, you know, should get something out of this presentation. One thing I'll mention real quick, just so I'm not thinking about it. Over the last couple years, I had a diagnosis of Parkinson's. So if you see this handshake, I've got asymmetrical Parkinson's. I just bring it up because I don't want to be thinking about it, and I don't want you to be thinking, you know, what is he going through, DTs, or what's going on, or what's this shaking about? Is he going to rattle himself to pieces while he's giving this thing? It's just it's the new Jaime. I've got some sort of neurological thing going on, but not a big deal. So when you see the right side kind of shaking, whatever. Yeah, I've got a nice presentation for you. I'm very happy to be here in Nashville. This is, in fact, my first time in Tennessee at all. So you got a really beautiful place here. So thanks a lot. Let's jump right into this. I revised this. I wanted to change some things, and I revised this especially for this event, you know. And the archetypal temple, just a couple of words about, I'm trying to stay within my parameters here. I'm going to disappear if I go too far in either direction. But yeah, I retooled this talk to kind of, you know, it's based on a book my last book that I wrote. I wrote 3 Masonic books. The first one was Myth, Magic, and Masonry, which actually, I should apologize for that one. It comes from papers that were like 10, 12 years old, like my beginnings in Masonry and trying to find my way through things. And it was just a lot of like intellectual diarrhea at that point. A lot of it I stand by. I mean, there's a lot of that book that I like, but there's some of it, you know, I've kind of turned the corner on over the years, you know, but that was kind of a compilation of papers that I wrote a long time ago. Then Approaching the Middle Chamber, my second book, that was one that I wanted to write about the essentially what we might call the staircase lecture, or the 7 liberal arts and sciences, or the middle chamber lecture, they sometimes call it. And I just wanted to unpack that sort of medieval scholasticism and how we have access to that in our ritual work. I'm not sure, I don't know Tennessee ritual, but do you guys have like the monitorial stuff, and you got a pretty good wide scope on the 7 liberal arts and sciences? Kinda? So, yeah. So that was my second book. And then this one, The Archetypal Temple, is kind of the realization. This is the one I'm most behind. This is kind of the realization of some of my thoughts on Masonic esotericism, let's say. And again, not that that should freak anybody out. In fact, look up when you get a chance, look up the word esoteric, and you'll see that if you were to change out the word esoteric and put Freemasonry there, it means it would totally match. It's like for the initiated, for people who have been exposed to this particular tradition. It's not anything weird. It doesn't equate to like alchemy, astrology, and magic per se. It's just specialized material for people like us who have been through a common experience, a common initiatory experience. So now we're talking about the archetypal temple, and there we go. So I've got a couple of ideas that I just want to form as the sort of bedrock of what we're talking about. That is, metaphysical temple building is the central project of Freemasonry. I just want to have us start at this foundation, that one of the things we do as Freemasons is metaphysical temple building. We're Freemasons, we're speculative Masons, and building the temple is part of what we do, right? A large part of what we do. And us as Freemasons thereby are metaphysical temple builders. We're not operative, stonemasons building operative, physical temples. We build metaphysical temples. And I'll get into what I mean by that. But I think, is that something I hope that we could just agree upon? Metaphysical temple builders. Not necessarily brick and mortar temples, but that building the temple is what we do as Freemasons, right? So if we can kind of agree on that just for now, you can change your mind later, but just for now to kind of agree on that, then maybe we can build on that, and I have a couple of proposals that I would make, and that is that temple archetype is realized on various sort of hermetic planes, right? From density to rarity. I'll show you what I mean. So this is the stuff I'm asking you to follow me on, and let's see if we can make sense out of this together. My second sort of proposition is this, that Freemasonry thereby is sort of hermetic and theurgical. And you might be like, what are these words? We're going to go over that. And at the end, we're going to tidy all this up. So I'm totally going to make sense out of this for everybody. And then lastly, and I think this is the most important, that within Freemasonry, there is an inherent design for what I say henosis, gnosis, theosis in the work of Freemasonry. And what I mean by that is there's an inherent design in our system, in speculative Freemasonry, for us to achieve what I hate to call enlightenment. But what I might call self-realization or self-actualization, that we can become better men. Let's say that. That's a common way to put it. Everybody can grab on to that, right? To become better men, using the working tools that we're given, the templates, that's an operative word, right? And the tools we are given with which to work our craft. So in that scope of work, we have what we need to become sort of realized people, realized men. And I'm going to argue that point. So again, that's a postulate, and that means it's subject to debate, but I just want to offer this based on a couple of predicates first. So what I mean by the archetypal temple, here's something that's funny. Has anybody read The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe? Not many? Okay, it's fine. I can tell you what it's about. Basically, this letter comes into possession of a blackmailer. He gets this letter, and it's basically some compromising information on an aristocratic woman. He has this information on this woman. Edgar Allan Poe wrote this. And so he's hiding this stuff. He's trying to blackmail her. So he takes this letter that would be very incriminating for her, and he hides it. So he has this letter in his rooms, as they used to say. If anybody's read that literature from the 19th century, it's always in his rooms, as opposed to saying in his apartment or anything. It's referred to as their rooms, which I always thought was funny. But in this guy's rooms, he's got this incriminating information on this woman, and he hides it. So the authorities, when that man is out of his rooms, they try and find this letter, right? So he has hidden the letter. So they look in all the bedposts, they look behind all of the portraits and the paintings, and they look all over this room looking for it. Essentially, it turns out that it's hanging so conspicuously from a ribbon from the mantle of the room. It's just hanging there where anybody, like essentially the center of the room, just hanging there. So it's a way of saying hidden in plain sight, right? The reason why I bring up the purloined letter, this letter that's in plain sight, is because I feel that this concept, the archetypal temple, is something that is so obvious and so front and center for all of us in the work that we do that it would be impossible to miss it, yet we never ever talk about it. You'll see what I mean. I'll talk about this and you'll be like, okay, I haven't heard this before, I haven't heard it this way before. But the thing is this is central material for us. This is about the Masonic experience exactly, right? The speculative temple building, the metaphysical temple building is exactly what we're talking about. The other thing is I say archetypal temple, but you might be like, what does that mean? What are we talking about? What does archetypal temple mean? So I like to clean that up a bit. When we talk of archetypes, maybe you've heard it from Carl Jung, or some other depth psychologist, this concept of the archetype. Here's essentially what it means. In the kind of, on the intellectual plane, there are these archetypal ideas that are not embodied, right? They're just ideas that have not found their way into manifestation, let's say. And these archetypal ideas, capital I, as Plato would put it, Plato's forms, Plato's ideas, these are in the ether. In fact, above the ether. They're on the noetic plane, in the intellectual sphere, as we say, right? So that's the archetype as such. And I'll give you an example on that in a second. But and then further, from that rarefied place, this intellectual abstract plane, as you kind of come down into the more dense planes, then you find examples of it. Those are the archetypal images. So you have an archetype as such, as they say, right? And then you have archetypal images as you get from rarity to density. And then temple is just, it comes from the Latin templum. A templum is a space that is designated for augury, really, for bird watching or the observing of celestial phenomena. It's usually an oblong square that the Roman augurs would mark out for them to do their essentially bird watching or auspices taken from birds and sort of astrological observations as well. So templum has both a temporal and a spatial sort of etymological root. And they go back to the same place. When we talk about templum, we're talking about words like temporal, which means ever pertaining to time. And we're also talking about space, a templum, an area that is demarcated for watching auspices, collecting auspices. So don't worry if that doesn't make sense right now. We're going to be totally fine. So let's talk about that archetype, right? I use what I call the fork analogy. In my second book, Approaching the Middle Chamber, I talked about a fork. So here's a good way to say that. Here in this plane where we function at barbecues and at restaurants and things like that, we might be given a fork, and that fork might be a salad fork, it might be a plastic, 4-prong fork, 4 tines. It might have 2 tines and be large and with a wooden handle that you use for barbecuing. It might be a salad fork, as I said. It might be any numbers of the way a fork manifests itself, It's partaking of this idea of forkness, but you can't point at any of these particular forks in this plane, on this plane. You can't point at any of those and say that is the fork upon which all other forks are based, right? So you're basically saying there are essential ideas of forkness and there are accidental ideas of forkness. The essential ideas are, and Aristotle talked about this, the essential ideas of forkness are that it must be a thing that you use to basically eat or do something with, and it has a certain number of tines, Think about the minimum that makes something a fork. The minimum sort of qualities that make something a fork, right? Those are the essential qualities of forkness. Accidental qualities of forkness are, is it wood? Is it white plastic? Is it black plastic? Is it made out of, metal, or what is it made out of? These are sort of accidental qualities of the fork. So this is kind of a way I like to explain archetypes. There's the quintessential fork, right? That just partakes of the very essence of forkness. And then there are all of these other forks on this plane that sort of partake of forkness. And we can call them a fork. We know what they are. Now, when we're talking about the temple, it's interesting because human beings have been making temples since at least Göbekli Tepe. And actually far before that, 30,000 years, let's say salute. 30,000 years before that, we see the evidence of burial sort of temples. And of course, there's Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago. This is a temple. So temples are things that human beings make. We don't see birds or monkeys making temples, right? I bring up beavers because beavers make dams. Beavers on every continent make dams, right? A beaver in Europe doesn't need to talk to a beaver in North America for it to understand what dam making is. They just sort of inherently know to make a dam. It's part of being a beaver, right? So for us as human beings, part of being a human being is we make temples. It's something that always happens. It's always happened. We sacralize or make sacred space and time. We make these sacred spaces and sacred times. And this is part of what we do as the human experience. We do this and we don't need to sort of communicate with people on the other side of, some other hemisphere. This is something we inherently have as human beings. This desire, this really basic desire to make temples. Don't you think that's weird? I mean, I think that's a pretty, it's already this abstract thing. And we're making temples as human beings. So there's something to that, I think. So that's what I mean by the archetypal temple. It's archetypal because it partakes of this idea of templeness, you might say, and it's something that all human beings are inherently hardwired to do, obviously. So the first place we start to see this idea of the temple is on the historical plane. We get news of places like Göbekli Tepe or King Solomon's temple in Scripture or any number of other temples, right? This is the historical idea. And as I said, it's sort of sacralized space. It's a space that we've made, an oblong square with a certain mosaic pavement and an orientation to the east and the west with the south. And it's a certain space that we have demarcated as a temple space. And it's almost always a model of the cosmos, which I'm going to get into quite a bit. We're always sort of creating, in microcosm, we're creating the cosmos, right? Anybody ever read, who's been blowing my mind is Mircea Eliade. Anybody ever read him? The Sacred and the Profane. If you can remember that, try and look up The Sacred and the Profane by Mircea Eliade. I can't believe it took me so long to find that book. And actually, I've had it on my shelf for like 5 years, basically. And I just got around to reading it maybe a month or two ago. Has anybody experienced that? You've got a book on your shelf, and then all of a sudden it's 5 years later, and you haven't read it yet, and you're like, I've had that experience with Mircea Eliade. It is outstanding what he talks about. In fact, that's kind of why I had to revise this talk, because I was so inspired by him. He's a Romanian sort of anthropologist. Really outstanding material. And if anybody likes Joseph Campbell and the sort of hero's cycle, the hero's journey, if you like that sort of stuff, you're going to love Mircea Eliade. Outstanding stuff. So he does talk about sacralizing space, making space sacred, making time sacred. And by time, here's a pretty neat idea. You know how the Greeks were good about their words, right? They were good about words like love. They didn't just have love that meant the physical act of love, brotherly love, They kind of broke it down in their language. They would have agape, which was, universal, unconditional love, God, divine love. They had philos, which is brotherly love. They had different eros, which is sexual love. So they kind of broke it out, So they had different words that would more succinctly sort of speak to what they were talking. They didn't just mean love like we mean love. It's just such a slippery word. They did the same thing with time. So the word time, they had chronos, chronic time, like where we get chronography and chronological and words like that. Those come from the Greek god Kronos. Kronos is the father time, essentially, right? An almost Saturnian kind of entity, right? That was sequential time. They had kairos, which is an interesting species of time. The kairos is the right time. Like, for instance, when the archer pulls back the bow and feels the optimal amount of tension and has his sight on his target and then lets the bowstring slip, that moment is the kairos. And the kairos is the right time. Different than chronos. It's a different type of time. It's a different quality of time. It's the kairos. And then finally, they had ionic time. And ionic time is this idea of eternal recurrence. This is ritual time. Like what we do in here, ritual time. We're repeating a certain tragedy. Master Masons know about this tragedy. It's an eternal recurrence, that just, it's a sacred time. It's a circular time as opposed to a linear time, So we differentiate that sort of hiero space and hiero time, We did that sort of holy spaces that we make and the holy sort of aspect of time, this eternal recurrence. So when we talk about the historical temple, these are some of the subjects we encounter. The classical temple. There's so much classical and neoclassical architecture here in Nashville. I feel like this is easy for me to bring up to you guys Because if you go to the Parthenon, which I had the pleasure of going to today, you realize that there are certain fractal motifs that are sort of built into classical architecture. Now, the Parthenon is a 1-for-1 with the Greek Parthenon. It's a ratio 1-to-1. I mean, it's an exact replica, right? 2 specks. So there's something called the module, where if you take the base of any of those columns and you go, sometimes it's halfway around it, sometimes it's the whole sort of diameter of one of the columns. But that number, when you take that number, that module, as they say, it is reflected throughout the entire structure. It's a fractal, like a fractal image that contains the whole, essentially. That's why it's so beautiful. And I mean aesthetically beautiful, because one thing that I hate is when people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You ever hear that? I think that's garbage. I think it's a garbage idea. I say that because beauty is not subjective. We have objective criteria by which we judge the beautiful. We have criteria for that already. We've had it for thousands of years at this point. It's ratio, proportion, harmony, symmetry, balance, etc. We have all of these ideas by which we judge the beautiful. That's why we have a philosophy called aesthetics, right? So ancient temple making, temple building, had this idea of aesthetics. It had the idea of the module. It had the idea of a fractal expanse where we take half of the base of one of the columns and reflect that number through the entire thing, you know? I think it's really striking. Not to mention things like animated statues that were ensouled. Animated, look at the word. It doesn't mean like to animate something like Walt Disney. To animate something is to ensoul it with anima. The anima is the soul in Latin. Anima, Latin, soul. To animate something is to ensoul it. So these statues were ensouled in these classic temples, right? And then there's this idea of theurgy, which we'll talk about kind of a little bit, right? But that's a little more challenging, but we'll tie that up in the end. So that is, in fact, my temple building in downtown Phoenix. It was built in 1925 or something like that, 25, 26, downtown Phoenix. That's the temple where my lodge meets. Now, this is a brick and mortar structure, because remember, we're talking about the temple archetype. We're talking about the temple from its most rarefied form and in all those intermediate spaces down to its most dense form, its most physical material form, which is where we are right now. We are in a Masonic temple, right? We're in a lodge room of a Masonic temple. So we have built this temple like we have built my temple in Phoenix and your temple downtown where the Grand Lodge meets, where the Scottish Rite is, if I understand that whole political thing correctly, who's there and what they're doing. So this is the mundane sort of physical place, right? And it is, remember how we talked about this, it is sacralized, it is made sacred through this tragic reenactment. So is anybody not a Master Mason here? Okay, we're fine. So basically there is this idea of eternal recurrence, time that is sacralized, right? And we have in Masonic ritual, and I think this is safe to say, we have motifs that are sacred to us. We have a central mystery, a tragedy, a mystery in the craft. That it is a tragic reenactment, much like like a mystery tradition in the ancient mystery cults of, the Greco-Roman mystery cults. We have something similar to that, let's say, in the most general way. So This is that sacralization, making sacred of time and space in a temple. We're talking about this temple, remember. Now, let's talk about a different plane of the temple. And so we've talked about brick and mortar. We've talked about the historical temple. We've talked about the classical temple. Let's talk about the mnemonic temple. In Freemasonry, we do a lot of memory work, do we not? I mean, when you meet proficiency, you have to do memory work. You have to meet a certain proficiency in memory in order to pass on to your next degree. So the way we do that is through essentially the method of loci, which is a very old method of memorization. This is Quintilian, Cicero, or Cicero if you prefer. This is a very old rhetorical device, this method of loci. Francis Yates writes about it in The Art of Memory, which is an outstanding book if you're interested in this sort of subject. Basically, what we do is this. Where did you go next? I was conducted to the northeast, where I was placed on the first step of a Mason. I went to the east. I went to the south. I was asked this question. I went over here. We're always talking about orientation. Look at the word, orientate something to. Orientation is to face something to the east. Orient is in there. It's to easternize something, is to orient something. So, I mean, it's just in the etymology of that word. So we're constantly referring to that. And we're constantly building the temple archetype mnemonically in our mind. When we do our memorization work, we are building a temple. Remember I said Freemasons are archetypal, sort of metaphysical temple builders, because we're always building this temple on many different planes. So one of the most important planes, which is why I hate to see when jurisdictions lessen the requirements of proficiency. You know, so you don't have to, all you need to know is signs, grips, and words. I don't like that idea. The reason why is not because I'm a stick in the mud or being curmudgeonly about it. It's not that. It's that it really does cheat the Mason out of perhaps the most important thing we can do. The most important thing we can do is build that mnemonic temple. Because if we build that memory temple, it stays with us forever. And you have a microcosmic temple in your mind. This is where that hermetic element starts to come in. It's a massive idea. We have to have that mnemonic temple. If we don't have that temple of memory that we build through orientation and moving around the lodge room of our mind, and my wife has seen me do this for hours upon hours over the last 13 years, you know. Me going like this, learning a lecture or something, and I'm in the temple in my mind, and I'm putting the pieces of it together, and I'm talking to the junior warden and the senior warden, and I'm talking to the various, my conductor, and, building this temple. We have to build that temple. That's our sort of connection to this, the egregorical temple. Now, over the last 5 years or so, we've started to hear this more. Brother Mark Stavish wrote a book called Egregors, and he's a Freemason up in Pennsylvania. And he wrote a book about this something that we've been throwing around in the fraternity for the last 5 years, is how long I've been sort of hearing this. It's gotten regular sort of currency in our common language that we share as Freemasons. How many people have heard the word egregor? So most of you have, half of you have. Basically, here's what it means. It's a collective thought form. And it's a thought form that we all share as Freemasons. And it can go to smaller levels. It could be the egregor of West Nashville Phoenix Lodge has its own egregor. You guys have a collective thought form. Every member of West Nashville Phoenix Lodge contributes to the egregor of that lodge. The egregor of that lodge is the collective genius, you might say, the collective thought form of that lodge. Every lodge has its own egregor, right? So basically, here's what happens. When all of us as Freemasons have this egregorical idea, this mnemonic temple that we've made through memory work, etc., and we sort of project that together as Freemasons, we make the Masonic egregorical temple. You know, because all of us have this idea of the temple that we've created, our mnemonic temple, our moral and ethical temple, you know, physical temples, our idea, capital I, our form, capital F, of the temple. You know, we all have this idea, and we're contributing to the larger Masonic egregorical temple. So think of it like this. Here's a good analogy. A holographic image, let's say, is made like this. There's various points of light that project, and there's interstices, or you know, there's places where the light meets, and they form essentially a three-dimensional image. I'm not sure how holography works, but I know that they can make like a Tupac Shakur out of light, basically, who's like a three-dimensional entity, right? So imagine that idea, except with the temple, and each Freemason is projecting their beam of light to making this egregorical temple. That's why I chose that image. You see all those beams of light? Imagine that and this isn't a fruity idea. I'm not into fruity hippie stuff. I really don't like it, you know? I don't. I like the idea of things that we can grab onto, that we actually do. And we do contribute to this grand idea of a temple together, right? So, and we're each a fractal of that. My mnemonic temple that I've spent, you know, years and years working on, and your mnemonic temple and your idea of a moral and ethical temple all contribute to the greater idea of a Masonic egregorical temple through imagination and visualization, etc. Now, I've been sort of skirting around this. This is something that is so basic and so in our face. I mean, it's so conspicuous in Masonic work, ritual documents. I mean, it's something that we always talk about. And we apply, our working tools have everything to do with this. And that is moral and ethical character development, making good men better. Obviously, it seems like such a fundamental Masonic thing. We take good men, vetted good men, and we make them better through moral and ethical, the application of our working tools, essentially. If you look at the definitions or how the working tools are conveyed to us in our rituals and things, you see that they have to do with moral rectitude or circumscription, like as in the compasses, and you know, all manner of moral and making a good, upright, square-dealing Freemason, you know. So this is another way that we're erecting that temple. So do you see where I'm going with this? I mean, I'm trying to show you that temple is made on the various planes, from density to rarity. A moral and ethical temple, an intellectual temple. So here's another one. When we get to the fellowcraft degree, we're giving basically the makings of a medieval scholastic 7 liberal arts education. You know, we're given the trivium, the quadrivium, and we're told to study these things. I don't know how many people actually do that. Embarrassingly, like, I don't know if it's embarrassingly, but I thought I had to learn that stuff. So after I was passed, like that night, I was like, oh my God, I got to learn all this stuff? Like, I'm going to actually have to learn rhetoric, arithmetic? What am I going to do? You know, I didn't even think I liked math and all that stuff, you know. Anyway, but when we do apply the tools that we are given, the opportunity that we are given to sort of, over time, chip away at this intellectual program that we have. It's basically medieval scholasticism. It comes from Martin Capella, a bunch of different places. In fact, my book, Approaching the Middle Chamber, I talk all about this. So I spend 500 pages talking about this sort of thing. But that's the development of the intellectual temple. That's another level on which we're building a temple as Freemasons. Here's another one. The microcosm and the macrocosm. Chief Hermetic idea, a very basic Hermetic idea, that the microcosm and the macrocosm are sort of in a resonant relationship with each other. And I need only point to the celestial sphere and the terrestrial sphere. That the celestial sphere is in a sympathetic, resonant relationship with the celestial sphere. This is just a basic Hermetic idea, and we have it all over the place in our lodge rooms, right? So man himself, says Rene Schwaller de Lubic's, is a sort of microcosm of the temple, just as the temple is a microcosm of the cosmos. The temple is somehow maybe, let's say, between man and the cosmos. It's this intermediate sort of a mesocosm, let's say. You have a microcosm, a macrocosm, and a mesocosm in between those two, So just another plane upon which the temple is built. So where are we all going with this? Like, why build a temple? What is the object? What is the aim? What is the completion and fruition of this project that we're giving? And I say that, well, I don't say this. Our ritual says to be fitted as living stones for that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Right? So we work on our mnemonic temple. We work on our moral and ethical temple, our intellectual temple, our egregorical temple, the brick and mortar temple. We work on the temple archetype in its expanse, on the various planes from density to rarity. We create the temple. We build the temple as Freemasons because this allows us to create a sort of metaphysical ladder from density to rarity to that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. The celestial, supra-celestial temple. This noetic, intellectual, Platonic temple. This temple of ideas and forms, this Empyrean temple, right? So that is the archetypal temple. That is the temple upon which all lower, more dense and material temples answer to this idea of a temple. Remember we talked about a fork, the very idea of forkness. That yes, we see various particular forks, but the universal fork is up here, which is the essential fork. These are just accidental forks. It's the same with the temple. We have the very idea of a temple, and then we have the various Masonic temples, etc., and human beings, because we are a temple in microcosm, right? So that's basically what I'm talking about. Now, I did want to put this slide at the beginning because this gives us a cosmological idea of what I've been talking about this whole time. This is kind of what I've been talking about is based on this model, but I felt it was probably better for me to put it at the end because it'll tidy things up for us. This is the Ptolemaic cosmology. The cosmos according to, well, Aristotle, but also Ptolemy, who put a lot of work into this model. Now, it is not geocentric. Yes, some people thought that early on, but let's call it georeferential. Georeferential just means the earth is the locus of human consciousness. It is from the earth that human beings perceive the rest of the cosmos. We're not standing on the sun. So there's, we can theoretically say, yes, the sun is the center of our solar system. It is, clearly. Nobody would argue that, right? Not even anciently, most people would not argue that. You can go back to Aristarchus. That was not being argued. Pythagoras as well. So what I'm saying is we are here on the earth in the sublunary sphere, the sphere below the moon. We are below the moon on the earth. And here we have the natural world, the world of the 4 states of matter. Earth, air, water, and fire. States of matter, I say that because earth, air, water, and fire, the 4 Empedoclean elements, are really just solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Earth, water, air, fire, respectively. These ancient philosophers, even the pre-Socratics, they didn't think that there was only, 4 elements per se. They didn't think in those terms. They thought about states of matter. So we have, and that in itself goes from density to rarity, because you have Earth. This is pre-gravitational. You have Earth. Water sits atop Earth. You have air, which bubbles go through water. This is observable stuff. And then you have fire, which is lighter than air. I mean, it's just a clear density to rarity kind of thing. So we get this from the Ptolemaic cosmology. And I like to bring this up because what I'm talking about is kind of based on this. And it's important to grasp this worldview if you're going to get deeper into what I've been talking about. Now, there's one other thing. We have that mechanism, and we're almost done here. We have that mechanism of the rarefied temple to the dense temple down here, and how at every sort of level, at every grade, we have the stratification of the temple archetype. The temple archetype as such, and then the various archetypal images of the temple that we are building as Freemasons. And I'm arguing that that's our central project. That is what we do as Freemasons. So there's one other thing about that model, is that it is an enchanted model. This is a kind of harder pill to swallow. That gasp, there is a creator entity, that there is a demiurgic creator, that there is we call him a grand architect of the universe, or great architect of the universe. This is a creator entity that we agree, that's our basically pronoun for God. That's what we use as Freemasons. The great architect of the universe. This is a creator entity. So if we do believe in an enchanted cosmos, as we would have with a great architect of the universe, an entity who is involved in this theurgical operation of cosmogony, making the cosmos, then we can think about that as moving down from the what Aristotle called the prime mover, down through his emanations, through the stars, through the planets, through the elements, through the animal, mineral, vegetable kingdoms, animal, vegetable, mineral kingdoms. We have the stratification. Just something to think about. So much of what we talk about in the craft betrays an enchanted pre-Enlightenment worldview. And I hesitate to bring this up, but there's so much about the Enlightenment, capital E movement, the Enlightenment, that I think has done a disservice to the world. And the reason why is because the Enlightenment, in its secularism, in its sort of disenchantment, has exorcised the anima mundi from our concept of the world. It has exorcised, as one would a demon, it has exorcised the spirit, the soul of the cosmos out of it. You know, it has left us with a world of weights and measures and dead stuff in space that is meant to be calculated. oh, that planet is dead. I'll tell you one thing, and I don't even normally get into this, but I will tell you. I remember standing outside. I was doing a lot of direct observation of celestial objects during 2020 when we had that great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And you're already thinking, Jaime, that's totally fruity. You know, that's astrology stuff. But I was watching that stuff, and I felt to myself as I saw what was going on the terrestrial sphere, as I read about what was happening, as I experienced what was happening, and I saw that that was hermetically reflected in the cosmos and that it was happening. You know, and these Jupiter and Saturn became conjunct on the first degree of Aquarius, and I read about that, and what does that mean? And I felt to myself when I was observing these planets and other celestial phenomena, I felt embarrassed. I felt like, who am I to say that that those planets only have the meaning and purpose that I deem fit to bestow upon them? Who am I? How arrogant is that? How like colossally hubristic it is for me to think that that the movement of celestial bodies and that cosmic drama is beholden to what I think about it. You know, it was embarrassing. That was the feeling. I felt arrogant. I felt tiny. You know, and that speaks to this idea of the great chain of being. That gasp. There is a that the cosmos is animated, that it is ensouled, and that it doesn't depend on me to give it meaning and purpose. So these are the takeaways. Just a couple of sentences, and then we're done. Metaphysical temple building is the central project of Freemasonry. We kind of started there. That's our project. That's what we do. Freemasons make metaphysical temples. We are temple builders, speculative temple builders. The temple archetype, as we've shown, is erected on the various planes, from density to rarity, that we build this temple, intellectually, morally, ethically, egregorically, mnemonically, and otherwise. Freemasonry is essentially hermetic and theurgical. And here's quickly what I mean about that. Hermetic would just mean that we participate in the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm and their sympathy. The sympathy between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Man as a miniature temple, the temple and the cosmic temple, that there's a relationship there at least. And then here's the last part I really want to leave you with, that there is an inherent design in Freemasonry, in the work that we all do as Freemasons, for henosis, gnosis, theosis, in the work of Freemasonry. Now here's what I mean. I just put those words because those are the most succinct way I could think of to say what I'm talking about, but you can say enlightenment or self-realization. That in our work, we have everything we need, theurgically, to make ourselves fitting ashlars for the house not made with hands. That we can use what we have in the craft, morally, ethically, mnemonically, spiritually, otherwise. That we can use what we have to make ourselves fitting ashlars for the supra-celestial temple, the most rarefied, abstract, archetypal temple, that we have everything we need in Freemasonry to reach this apotheosis of ourselves, right? That we can be elevated through these spheres of density, through rarity, into this cosmic, supracosmic temple. And we have all that already in our work. That's what I got for you. Thank you.